I always like to start out by saying something about what I do, because cognitive and archaeology never seem to quite go together. Let's see if I can maneuver this so I'm organized.
There's a clicker there.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Which one is the clicker?
The big one.
The big
in the
one,
middle goes
yes.
forward and the one
I
underneath goes back.
suppose I can manage this thing. So my field is researching literacy and numeracy as complex cultural systems. And probably the easiest way to explain what I do is to differentiate it from the cuneiformist. They're interested in what things mean. The semiotician is interested in why things mean. As an archaeologist, I'm interested in how things mean and what change in material form can tell us about change in behaviors in brains, and how interacting with material forms changes behaviors in brains. Writing may appear to be static, like what is shown here, carved in stone to emphasize its permanency. But writing is a material form that has changed a lot over time. It has become increasingly refined through generations of tinkering and adjustment to elicit specific behavioral and psychological responses in its users. That's the aspect of writing that I am investigating. We can't study ancient cognition directly. However, material forms like writing imply behaviors like handwriting and psychological processes like vision and language. When interpreted through neuroscience, change in material form implies change in behaviors in brains, and literacy would have required all three. Literacy also required that a society sustain its behaviors with specific material forms over multiple generations. And Philip set me up nicely with ideas about agency and introducing Malaphoris. The basic idea is that cognition is a dynamic system composed of brains, bodies, and materiality. The influence is multi-directional. Interaction with material forms changes behaviors in brains. Change in behaviors in brains enables further change to material forms. And material forms accumulate the cognitive effort of past generations, and they act as a medium for recreating those changes in present and future generations. An analysis like this requires two things: a material record with enough duration and extent to show change in detail, change over time in detail, and a cognitive state understood well enough that change in material form can suggest change in behaviors in brains. It also helps to have a theoretical framework that can reconcile interdisciplinary data and compare before and after cognitive states without prejudice. And I'm using Malaphoris's material engagement theory, which has three central commitments. The first is the idea that minds are extended, so material forms are a part of the mind. Reading is an excellent example of this, since it's difficult to imagine how we would read without the material form that is writing. Second, materiality influences change in behaviors in brains. And third, materiality is meaningful in a way that differs from language. And today I'm going to focus on the last two. I'm going to start with the model of how literacy develops, which used Mesopotamia as its case study. What I did is I compiled data on Mesopotamian writing from the literature and sorted them into 7 categories, from the making of dictionaries known as lexicography to the identifiability of language. Then I mapped these data across time and cultural periods so I could see what was changing and when, and what was changing in conjunction with it, and get a sense of how writing changed over time. That plot was initially very difficult to create, but I realized later that turned on its side, it's a standard archaeological chronology. To understand what change in written form tells us about change in behaviors in brains, we need to start with what makes a brain literate. In literacy, the region that recognizes physical objects becomes trained to recognize written characters as if they were physical objects, interpret them through the gestures of handwriting, and associate them with the meanings and sounds of language. This neurofunctional reorganization is common across writing systems, whatever their form, and regardless of whether signs map to words, syllables, or phonemes. Among the changes in material form, here is one of the most dramatic. Early signs resemble objects, later signs do not. This change is sometimes called increasing abstractness, though abstract is one of those squishy terms that means different things in different contexts. And it's amazingly imprecise, and I disagree with it on that basis alone. Here it means less depictive, and it suggests that brains are learning to recognize characters as objects. Brains recognize objects through combinations of their local and global features. This works as follows. You might see a cube in the combination of features, though the lines aren't actually there. Local features are the circles and cutouts. Global features, the relations between them. Recognizing words is similar. You likely see the words the cat, though the middle characters are neither H nor A. Meaning is derived from the characters, the context of adjacent characters, and the associations that you've learned between written forms and language. Trained object recognition and learned lexical associations account for variability in script form and mapping, as the potential for an object to be recognized through its features and associated lexically is independent of its actual form. As brains became trained to recognize features and associate lexically, the need for characters to depict was relaxed. That is, as characters became topologically recognized, they could deform. This in turn allowed characters to become more alike and simpler. By more alike, I mean there is still some resemblance between the early forms on the left and the later forms on the right. However, later forms are actually closer in appearance to each other than the early forms were. That is, the clues distinguishing early signs are more obvious than the clues distinguishing later signs. Visual discriminability and individuation, being able to tell characters apart and identify single characters as themselves, depend on familiarity. With familiarity, objects become easier to tell apart, so the distinguishing clues can become more subtle. These effects are also found in facial recognition, particularly across ethnic groups, where they affect things like eyewitness identifications. Topological recognition let characters lose their depictiveness while differentiating in ways that enhance our ability to tell them apart. This is the process whereby graphic elements become a contrastive system. This process occurs without change to the way graphic elements are mapped to language, so writing can become a contrastive system, whether it is logographic, syllabic, alphabetic, or some combination. This change also shows why training had to become more formal. Written characters became too much alike. It had been relatively easy to tell the earlier pictures apart, but as characters grew more alike, the differences between them were too subtle for anyone who lacked familiarity. And by simpler, I mean that characters lost some of their detail, suggesting an optimization or balance of local and global detail. Local detail helps novices, but slows proficient readers, who make greater use of global cues. In later writing periods, local details were omitted, suggesting readers were making greater use of global cues. And certainly, the more details that characters have, the longer they take to write. So as you lose detail, you also gain some speed of production. In modern scripts, the same effect is found in diacritics for tones in African languages and vowels for Hebrew. Discussion involves the potential for having different forms of written language, one for novices and one for proficient readers. Of course, the trade-off is that readers have to learn both. If you think that learning one is hard enough, learning two is even more daunting. Let's talk about handwriting, the motor movements controlled by Exner's area of the brain. Exner's, and this is not a neurofunctionally accurate depiction of Exner's area. Exner's area is thought to help us recognize the gesture in the written word, a mental simulation. Its activity is particular to handwriting, not just any fine work involving the hand. So while it's possible to produce characters by, say, carving them into stone, carving differs both in the movements used and the character repetition involved. Handwriting improves fine motor skills, hand-eye coordination, recognition and recall functions, lexical retrieval, and tolerance for ambiguity in how characters are formed. Think sloppy handwriting. In the emergence of literacy, handwriting would have been critical. Not only would it have improved these functions, it afforded a mechanism for continual change in the material form, which was essential to the system's ability to change. And change in handwriting implies things like standardization, automaticity, and tolerance for ambiguity. Standardization is forming each character with particular strokes in a particular order. When writing first began, there was no such protocol. Standardization emerged gradually. It's seen in the strokes used and the order in which they were made, which become increasingly codified. Over time, these show production becoming standardized, and standardization shows handwriting behavior becoming automatic. Automaticity frees up cognitive resources like attention and working memory. The same thing happens when we learn to drive. At first, we pay lots of attention to operating the car and conditions on the road, if we're doing it right, and I wondered about my kids. As proficiency is gained, though we attend less to these things, becoming alert only when conditions change. This leaves us free to attend to thoughts and conversation and not texting, as I remind them. In writing, automaticity lets us focus on what we're writing, its content, and not how we're writing, its production. This helps transform writing from a tool that simply records mental content to one that lets us engage it directly. When we write by hand, we develop a tolerance for ambiguity in how characters are formed. This lets us recognize them while providing early writing an important mechanism for change. This tolerance is one of the things educators fear will be lost as we type more and handwrite less, though arguably the loss will be offset by the standardized appearance of characters on screens and the things computers do really well that handwriting can't, like speed and networking and information lookup and emoticons, which add facial expressions to writing, which is really interesting. Being able to recognize characters even when they're ambiguous is an essential element of developing cursive, which trades accuracy of form for speed of production. Fast writing keeps up better with our speed of thought, so that writing becomes a highly interactive engagement between mental content, material form, and the behaviors interfacing the two. Characteristics of clay surfaces and writing implements also influenced how characters were made. Making lines or impressions on clay produces furrows, which is how their order of production is determined. Furrows also meant that characters had to be relatively simple and made with deliberation, since complex characters and characters made in haste quickly yield an illegible mess. In turn, simplicity improved speed of production, while deliberation improved legibility and reduced error. Simplicity also influenced production at a fundamental level. Characters taking hours to make wouldn't record or communicate information efficiently because of their restricted volume, nor would they support the recombination needed to produce new signs. Over some 15 centuries, the cognitive system changed from a functional reading and writing, in which language was not very fluent, to a state more akin to the literacy we enjoy, where the material form represents language with fidelity. Let's look for these threads among the data. Characters lost depictiveness and then simplified, suggesting written objects were being recognized by their features and becoming a system of contrastive elements with an optimized balance of local and global cues. How characters were made converged on wedges, improving legibility as well as visual discriminability and individuation, and handwriting became standardized, suggesting automaticity. By 2000 BC, a literacy on par with what we mean by the term appears to have developed. Words were no longer being split between lines of text, a contiguity of form consistent with object recognition. Cursive developed, showing tolerance for ambiguity that enabled an even greater speed of production. Experimentation became widespread with writing applied to many new purposes. A concern with content suggesting automaticity had repurposed cognitive resources like attention. And training had become highly formal because script could no longer be read without it. The types and rate of change also decrease around this time. Beyond detailing chronological change in literacy, the model illuminates something about our relation with material culture and its role within the human cognitive system. Forget for a moment that writing subjects language and ideas to analysis and communicates them across space and time. Instead, consider only its material form. It is difficult to imagine what sort of thing literacy could be without that material form and the behaviors that engage it. Interaction with the materiality of writing engages specific behaviors and psychological capacities. Over centuries of adjustment, the material form has become adept at eliciting specific behavioral and psychological responses. And while it changed, the material form remains synchronized to common behavioral and psychological capacities because it passed through the many hands of multi-generational collaboration. It acts as a medium for recreating those changes in present individuals as they learn to act with it. And it embodies and makes available the change, all that past cognitive effort. And through characteristics and mechanisms like malleability and contrast of form and structure, it affords possibilities for future change. The model suggests developing literacy involved an initial repertoire of signs with conventionalized this means that associations. These had to be written by hand enough hours per day and days over time that object recognition was trained and automaticity was afforded. Signs had to be simple, and the material form malleable enough to enable production, repetition, recombination, and change. Finally, the signs couldn't be numerical, as numbers lacked the lexical range, the need for phonography, and the ambiguity needed to motivate linguistic fidelity. And I'll talk about these a little more in a bit. I published the model in 2016. While it generated some unique insights, it has the potential to be expanded further. Its development was idiosyncratic, meaning I did it by myself, and I don't know everything there is to know about everything. Its expansions and revisions should be less so. The model doesn't currently distinguish unintentional from deliberate change or direct from indirect influences. It doesn't consider selective, artistic, or playfulness aspects to iconicity. Factors explainable psychologically and behaviorally, like standardization and loss of depiction, seemed more critical to the processes than ones that could not, like lexicography. But explanatory ease is not the right criterion, and I hesitate to discard any data from the model until it's been applied to another case. I'd also like to specify more clearly the factors included and their level of detail, and the criteria for assessing the attainment of literacy. Mesopotamian literacy isn't universal, and that's another caveat. In Egypt, right next door and at about the same time, writing underwent not one but two phases of standardization and losing depictiveness and detail. Where Mesopotamian writing developed from administrative practices, Egyptian writing was more aligned with religious and state purposes, things affecting the amount of writing behavior and likely influencing how quickly the respective systems changed. Incorporating cases like Egypt into the model will help gain traction on the critical changes, temporal sequencing, and functional interdependencies inherent in the process. Another place the model might be expanded is numbers, since numerical notations differ from writing for language in several respects. Numeracy and literacy are dissociable phenomena. That is, while some cultures have developed both, many societies develop numbers without writing, and a few have developed writing without numbers. These differences have implications for sign forms and for the ways signs change as they are transmitted across languages and cultures. There's a fundamental difference in how signs for numbers mean. This appears in early writing, where signs for quantity were repeated, signs for commodity were not. Numerical signs instantiate quantity. That is, 4 wedges are 4, 6 cones are 6. Their quantity is unambiguous even across languages, so these signs don't need to be specified further, even if conventionalized. In comparison, pictographs signify through resemblance, ideographs through convention. This makes them ambiguous, obviously a range of related meanings, but it necessitates strategies like memorization, determinatives, and phonography to specify the words intended. Instantiation makes written numbers contiguous with numbers that are not written, something with no counterpart in non-numerical language. That is, 3 fingers, 3 beads on an abacus, and 3 strokes in the Roman numeral 3 are 3. Instantiation is meaningful without the phonetic component of language, making numbers a semasiographic system. This has no counterpart in language, since there is no inherent sheepness to the letters U to U or a quartered circle. Signs for language must also be modified to specify the words intended. That is, fidelity to language requires the inclusion of phonographic techniques and conventions, making writing lottographic. Semasiographic notations like numbers and music can be read in any language because they are semantically meaningful but not phonetically specified. This allows different choices of words and syntax when they are put into language. Glottographic writing represents the meanings and sounds of particular languages, like the pictures that represent the sounds "I can see you" in English through the rebus principle, and the logographic, syllabic, and alphabetic scripts of Chinese, Japanese, and German. Numbers don't need phonetic specification, and in fact, phonography reduces their ability to represent spatial, topological, and geometric relations, things essential to pattern recognition and information manipulation. This quality means using numbers does not require knowing the associated language, the difference between using Roman numerals and knowing the names in Latin. Words for numbers, on the other hand, require knowing the particular language and being able to read the associated script. Number words don't have the same ability to preserve relations, make patterns accessible, or manipulate numerical information. Think addition on vocabulary. or algebra in the form of paragraphs, which is actually how they did it when they started inventing algebra. And they estimate it slowed the development of algebra by centuries until they invented the signs that would let them do more semasiographic manipulation. Let's see. Semasiographic notations like numbers and music can be read in any language. Oh, I think I'm on the wrong page. Let's see, 38. Interrupted myself, lost my place. Numbers also have a much longer material prehistory than their involvement with writing, though handwriting numbers arguably causes a dramatic change in numeracy. This is because of the neurological reorganization that occurs when we handwrite signs, including numbers. For language, if societies don't write by hand, they don't become literate. This isn't true for numbers, which don't need to be written, since they can be represented with material forms like fingers and beads. Nonetheless, handwriting has distinct elaborational effects on numbers. Numbers that aren't written are collections. Numbers that aren't written are collections. Numbers that are written become entities, recognized topologically through their features. Functionally, written numbers are concise to a degree other material forms of numbers are not. Concision let relations like multiplications be collected into tables, which scribes learned as part of their training. This would redefine numbers through their relations to each other, making them entities in a relational system, which is how we think of numbers today. Written language was critical to developing mathematics. As writing became more expressive, it was used to record calculations, not as results, as was true with earlier technologies like tokens, and not as equations like we would do. Instead, they were recorded as narrative descriptions, like this area calculation from the second millennium. It would take another several millennia for operations to be redefined as semasiographic forms, like our plus and minus signs. Numerical representations instantiate quantity, and this is something we perceive through an evolutionarily ancient ability, the number sense we share with other species. Our perception of quantity means we can recognize 1, 2, and 3, an ability known as subitization. Without counting, quantities larger than about 4 are just many, but here we can appreciate bigger and smaller in groups, an ability called magnitude appreciation. I thought of all this yesterday when we were reading about the Owen script. Here are tally marks for the numbers 1 through 10. The lowest ones can be appreciated without counting because they are subitizable. More than about 4 marks become more increasingly difficult to appreciate because they are above the subitization range. But here we appreciate differences in magnitude, like seeing that there are fewer to one side and more on the other. Groups with the lowest number of elements are easy to appreciate, so their form as signs needs very little alteration. Groups higher than the subitizing range are rearranged into subitizable subgroups, but these too have a finite ability to be rearranged for appreciability, so we tend to bundle or group them. In between subitizing and bundling, subitizable subgroups remain under pressure to avoid being counted, and this makes them likely they will simplify. Signs for subitizable numbers tend to be highly conserved as a result because they instantiate quantity in the range we can see. Large numbers like 7 are initially grouped as smaller appreciable quantities. Over time, these become forms that avoid counting, which then become increasingly subject to mechanisms that change written forms, like visual distinguishability and individuation. For both these categories, semasiography means that numbers can be, and often are, adopted across languages and cultures without phonetic or semantic adaptation. This limits the amount of change these written forms undergo in transmission. Writing for language, in comparison, undergoes a lot of change. It's already under pressure to achieve greater semantic and phonetic specificity. When a system of writing is adapted to different languages, it initially does a poor job of representing at least some concepts and sounds by an amount that varies with affinities between populations. This keeps writing for non-numerical language under pressure to specify concepts and sounds, including those of the adopting languages and cultures. This same pattern appears to hold in Chinese. Subitizable numbers change the least, large numbers by an intermediate amount, and non-numerical words the most. This is despite the fact that transmission occurs across a relative homogeneity of language and culture. The form of the higher numbers also suggests, to me anyway, that they had been available for some time, long enough to become forms that did not require counting before they appear in the oracle bones. In summary, written representations for numbers in language experience distinct neurofunctional pressures that influence the forms they take how these forms transmit across languages and cultures, and how these forms change over time. Signs for numbers instantiate, small numbers conserve, large numbers simplify. Signs for non-numerical language, in contrast, signify. So they must specify meanings and sounds, subjecting them to the greatest amount of change. How am I doing on time? A few more minutes? Okay. Then I shall talk about my last topic, the effective tool use by social groups. The model I've done of literacy suggests that sustained societal investment in specific behaviors and material forms yields cognitive change and creativity that cannot be realized by single individuals or generations alone. This suggests that current models of tool use and cognition should expand beyond the individual to the group. Cognitive aspects of tool use have been modeled with blacksmithing. The model emphasizes performative skill, expertise, and aha moments generating insight. Tools structure and intensify behaviors and select individuals to specific tasks and social roles. The individual model does not, however, represent social tool use. Here, tools are a collaborative medium that influences group behaviors and brains toward common change. Group tools create communities of specialists, people able and identified for using specific tools. Group tool use also affects tool form. Though human behaviors and brains have much in common, people differ in their psychological, physiological, and behavioral attributes. Most individual variability cancels itself out. Highs counteract lows, keeping tool forms synchronized to average capabilities while allowing tool forms to change. Synchronization, in turn, distributes the average to new users, influencing cohesion in the social group. Cumulative variability yields tools that remain widely accessible despite their change in form. For example, reading and writing required no unusual capacity in psychological processes like attention, nor physiological attributes like fine motor control. I mean, of course, the basic ability to read and write, and not all of the conceptual domains made accessible by the technology. This research helps us understand how societies of average people achieve complex systems like literacy and numeracy. The insights generated are not just applicable to how complex cultural systems developed in ancient times, but to the coevolution of cognition and culture in general, including our own present and future. Thanks very much for your attention.